The moment the human stepped in front of her, the entire alley went silent. Acid rain hissed against rusted metal roofs as Mason Reed pushed through the crowded lower district of Colony 9 with his jacket pulled tight against the freezing wind. Neon signs flickered overhead in broken reds and sickly blues while steam rolled from cracked vents beneath the street. Somewhere nearby, an old generator groaned like it was dying one bolt at a time. Mason ignored it all. After 12 hours repairing med scanners at Dock Sector C, he wanted coffee, silence, and maybe 4 hours of sleep before another double shift. Then he heard the shouting. Sharp voices. Military voices. He slowed near the mouth of a narrow alley where 6 colonial soldiers stood in a half-circle beneath a blinking security drone. Their polished gray armor reflected the rain in fractured silver lines. In the center of them, someone was on the ground. At first, Mason thought it was just another smuggler getting hauled away. It happened every night in the lower districts. But then the figure moved slightly, and the hood covering her face slipped back. Turquoise skin, silver hair soaked by rainwater, golden eyes barely open. Alien. One of the soldiers grabbed her arm and forced her upright against the wall. You should have disappeared when you had the chance, the captain muttered. The woman didn't answer. Her breathing sounded uneven, almost mechanical, like every breath hurt. Mason noticed faint burns across the sleek, dark fabric covering her shoulders and the thin metallic collar locked around her throat. Not military. Prison transport. The drone above scanned her face again. Wanted for treason flashed briefly across its red lens. People walking past the alley kept their heads down. Nobody stopped. Nobody ever stopped. The captain raised a small pulse sidearm toward the woman's chest. Orders are orders. Mason should have kept walking. Any sane person would have. Colonial soldiers weren't cops. They answered directly to the corporate governors, and the governors didn't like witnesses. But the woman looked exhausted more than dangerous. Cold, cornered, alone, and for one strange second, her eyes met his through the rain. There wasn't fear in them, just disappointment, like she already knew nobody was coming. Mason exhaled slowly. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Then he stepped into the alley. That's enough. The soldiers turned instantly. The captain frowned behind his visor. Move along, civilian. Mason ignored him and looked directly at the alien woman. Up close, she looked worse. Rainwater mixed with pale blue blood near her temple, and her knees shook hard enough that she could barely stand. You okay? Mason asked quietly. The captain laughed once. She won't be for long. Mason's jaw tightened. Seems excessive for one woman. Not your concern. The pulse weapon lifted slightly higher. Mason could hear the woman's breathing hitch behind him. Could feel the tension in the alley pulling tighter like a cable ready to snap. The drone rotated overhead with a low electronic hum. Warning lights reflected across wet pavement. Every survival instinct in Mason's body told him to leave. Instead, he stepped directly between the soldiers and the alien woman. Rain struck his shoulders in cold sheets. She's under my protection now, he said. Silence. Complete silence. Even the drone paused for half a second. Behind him, the woman suddenly froze. One soldier actually laughed in disbelief. You've got to be kidding. But the captain didn't laugh. His visor dimmed slightly as legal protocols scrolled across his display. Colonial protection claims. Rare. Old. Still valid. Mason didn't miss the subtle shift in the soldier's posture. They were irritated now. Careful. Behind him, the alien woman stared at his back like she couldn't understand what she was hearing. Then her weak voice finally broke through the rain. Human, she whispered carefully. Do you understand what those words mean to my species? Rainwater rolled down Mason Reed's face as the alley remained frozen in uneasy silence. The captain lowered his pulse weapon by half an inch, not out of mercy, but calculation. Colonial law was old, messy, and filled with loopholes written during the first alien trade treaties nearly 80 years earlier. Most people ignored those laws because most people were smart enough not to involve themselves with wanted fugitives. Mason was beginning to suspect he was not one of those smart people. Protection claim confirmed, the drone announced in a flat synthetic voice. Temporary civilian custody acknowledged pending judicial review. One of the soldiers groaned softly. You have got to be kidding me. The captain's visor glowed faint red as legal text scrolled across the inside of his helmet. You realize what happens if she commits a crime while under your claim, he said coldly. Mason shrugged slightly, even though his pulse had started climbing hard in his chest. Then I guess that becomes my problem. Behind him, the alien woman stared at him without blinking. Up close, Mason could hear the faint metallic tremor in her breathing. Whatever had happened to her before this alley, she had been running for a long time. The captain stepped closer until rain hissed across the polished gray armor between them. You do not even know what she is. I know she looks half dead. She is classified as a hostile intelligence asset. Mason glanced over his shoulder briefly. The woman looked more exhausted than dangerous. Her silver hair clung to her face in soaked strands, and faint blue marks pulsed beneath her skin near the collar around her throat. Not natural. Some kind of restraint tech. Still looks human enough to need help, Mason replied quietly. The soldiers exchanged annoyed looks. Nobody liked complications during night patrols. Paperwork killed moods faster than gunfire. Finally, the captain stepped back. Fine. She is your responsibility now. His visor locked onto Mason one last time. But when this goes wrong, civilian, remember that you chose it. The patrol moved out seconds later, boots splashing through shallow puddles as the drone followed overhead. The alley grew quiet again except for distant thunder and the low hum of neon signs flickering against wet concrete. Mason exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered. That could have gone better. The alien woman suddenly swayed against the wall. Mason caught her arm before she collapsed completely. Her skin felt ice cold even through his gloves. Golden eyes snapped toward him instantly, sharp despite the exhaustion. Do not touch me. Her voice came out strained but proud. Mason released her immediately and raised both hands slightly. Okay, sorry. She studied him carefully, like she still expected some hidden motive to reveal itself. Most humans in Colony 9 only interacted with aliens for business, military contracts, or trouble. Nobody stepped in front of soldiers for strangers. Especially not strangers wearing prison restraints. Mason glanced at the metallic collar around her throat again. Tiny indicator lights blinked weakly across the black alloy surface. That thing tracking you? He asked. She hesitated before answering. Among other things. Can you remove it? A bitter expression crossed her face. If I could, they would not have found me so easily. Somewhere above them, another patrol shuttle roared through the storm clouds. The woman flinched slightly at the sound. Mason noticed immediately. Fear. Not of him. Of being found again. He rubbed rainwater from the back of his neck and looked toward the glowing streets beyond the alley. His apartment was small, noisy, and smelled faintly like burnt coffee year-round, but it had walls, heat, and old signal blockers left over from his military days. He sighed. You need a place to stay tonight. Her eyes narrowed instantly. And what exactly do you expect in return, human? Mason blinked once. Then he laughed quietly under his breath. Not mocking, just tired. Honestly, he pulled his jacket tighter against the freezing rain. At this point, I would settle for not getting arrested before morning. For the first time since he had stepped into the alley, the alien woman looked genuinely confused. The walk back to Mason Reed's apartment took 23 minutes through freezing rain and crowded midnight streets that smelled like engine coolant, wet concrete, and burnt food from overloaded market stalls. Neon advertisements flickered above them through the storm haze while cargo shuttles crossed overhead like dark shadows against the clouds. The alien woman followed 3 steps behind him the entire time. Silent, careful, watching every reflection in every window they passed. Mason noticed she never stayed near open intersections longer than necessary. Survival instinct. Military training maybe. Or fear. Probably both. Every few minutes he glanced back just to make sure she had not collapsed somewhere behind him. She looked close to it. Her movements had become slower since leaving the alley, and the metallic collar around her throat pulsed faint blue beneath the rainwater, soaking her skin. Once, she stumbled near a cracked sidewalk vent releasing steam into the street. Mason instinctively reached toward her arm. She immediately recoiled. I can walk. Her voice remained sharp despite the exhaustion behind it. Mason raised his hand slightly. Okay. They kept moving. Colony 9 never really slept. Even at nearly 2 in the morning, the lower sectors buzzed with noise. Vendors shouted beneath waterproof tarps. Maintenance drones crawled across building walls, spraying sparks into the darkness. Somewhere nearby, old music drifted from a second-story apartment window. Human laughter followed it briefly before disappearing into the storm. The alien woman looked around with quiet suspicion, taking in every face they passed. "You all live like this?" she asked suddenly. Mason shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets against the cold. "Like what?" "Compressed. Loud. Chaotic." He smirked faintly. "That is one way to describe rent prices." She stared at him for a second like she could not tell whether he was joking. Finally, she looked away again. By the time they reached his apartment building, the rain had turned heavier. Water streamed down the rusted metal exterior in silver sheets, while a broken security sign buzzed weakly near the entrance. Mason punched the access panel twice before the old door finally groaned open. "Welcome to luxury living," he muttered. The hallway smelled faintly of recycled air and machine oil. Half the ceiling lights flickered on delayed timers. Somewhere upstairs, someone was arguing loudly in another language while plumbing rattled inside the walls like distant thunder. Mason climbed 2 flights of narrow stairs before stopping outside apartment 2B. He unlocked the door and stepped aside. "Carefully. You can come in." The alien woman hesitated. Her golden eyes moved from the dark hallway to the small apartment beyond the doorway. It was not impressive. 1 room. Old gray couch. Tiny kitchen. Work boots near the heater vent. A stack of repair manuals sitting beside an outdated coffee machine that looked one electrical failure away from retirement. Warm yellow light filled the room softly. Safe light. Human light. Mason tossed his soaked jacket over a chair and moved toward the kitchen counter. "There is coffee if the machine still works." 50-50 chance. No answer. He turned slightly and realized she was still standing near the doorway. Tense. Unmoving. Rainwater dripped silently from strands of silver hair onto the floor beneath her boots. "You really are afraid of me," he said quietly. Her gaze sharpened immediately. "I do not fear weak men." Mason blinked once. "Good to know." She stepped inside at last, though carefully, like she expected hidden restraints to appear the second the door closed. Mason pretended not to notice. He grabbed a clean towel from the bathroom shelf and held it out toward her. "Here." She looked at the towel suspiciously, then at him. "You humans always offer fabric during moments of tension?" Mason leaned against the counter, only to people dripping on the floor. For a brief second, something almost invisible softened in her expression. Not trust, not comfort, just confusion again, like she could not understand why he kept acting normal. She slowly accepted the towel without speaking. Her fingers brushed his hand for less than a second before pulling away instantly. Cold. Far colder than they should have been. Mason frowned slightly. "You are freezing. I will recover." That sounds like something people say right before passing out. She ignored him and scanned the apartment instead. Her eyes paused briefly on framed military photographs sitting near the shelf above the heater. Human soldiers. Medical unit insignias. Mason noticed immediately and sighed quietly. "Former combat medic," he explained before she could ask. "That explains the hero complex." Mason laughed softly under his breath while turning toward the struggling coffee machine. "Trust me," he said. "If I had a hero complex, I would live somewhere nicer than this." Behind him, the alien woman stared silently at the steam rising from the old heater vent while rain hammered against the apartment windows. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered something in her own language. Mason did not understand the words, but the sadness inside them filled the entire room. The old coffee machine rattled like it was fighting for its life before finally releasing a stream of bitter black liquid into 2 mismatched metal cups. Mason Reed slid one carefully across the counter toward the alien woman. "It tastes terrible," he warned, "but it is hot." She stared at the cup for several seconds before taking it with both hands. The steam rising into her face seemed to calm something inside her almost immediately. Outside the apartment windows, rain hammered endlessly against the city while distant shuttle engines echoed between the crowded towers of Colony 9. The tiny heater near the wall hissed weakly, struggling against the cold leaking through old insulation panels. Mason sat down on the couch across from her and stretched tired muscles beneath his gray thermal shirt. Only now, under proper light, could he see how damaged she really looked. The sleek dark suit covering her body had small tears burned through the fabric near her shoulder and side. Faint blue bruising spread beneath the turquoise skin of her neck where the metallic collar rested. Every few seconds the device emitted a soft electronic pulse. Monitoring her. Hurting her maybe. "What does it do?" Mason asked quietly, nodding toward the collar. Her golden eyes lifted slowly from the cup. It suppresses bioelectric output, meaning if I attempt to access certain abilities, it punishes me. Mason frowned. That sounds illegal. A faint bitter smile touched her lips. Your colony has many interesting definitions of legality. He could not argue with that. Silence settled between them again. Not comfortable silence yet. Careful silence. The kind shared by two people still deciding whether the other one was dangerous. Mason took a slow sip of coffee and instantly regretted it. Yeah, he muttered. Still awful. To his surprise, the alien woman made a soft sound that almost resembled amusement. Very small, very brief, but real. Mason noticed immediately. There it is, he said. Proof you are capable of smiling. Her expression closed again almost instantly. Do not misunderstand me, human. Mason. She blinked once. What? My name. It is Mason. She studied him quietly over the rim of the metal cup before answering. Lasara. The name sounded soft but elegant, carrying a musical rhythm unfamiliar to human speech. Mason nodded once. Nice to officially meet you, Lasara. Something about the way he said her name seemed to catch her off guard. No mockery. No fear. Just normal conversation. She looked away first. The rain outside intensified, wind rattling the apartment windows hard enough to make the old glass vibrate. Mason stood and moved toward a storage cabinet near the kitchen. You should probably let me look at those injuries. Lasara immediately stiffened. No, you are limping. I said no. Mason leaned lightly against the cabinet with tired patience rather than frustration. Former medic, remember? Human medical training does not apply to my species. Good thing pain still looks the same in every language. Her jaw tightened slightly. Mason noticed she always reacted strongest when someone showed concern, as if kindness itself made her uncomfortable or suspicious. Slowly, carefully, he pulled a small emergency med kit from the cabinet and placed it on the table between them without moving any closer. Your choice, he said simply. But if that collar is stressing your nervous system, untreated shock could become a problem. Lasara's eyes narrowed. Why are you helping me? Mason sighed softly through his nose. There it was again. The question she kept returning to like she physically could not process the answer. He sat back down across from her. Because somebody should. That is not enough reason. It is for me. She stared at him in complete silence. Rain hissed against the windows behind her, while warm yellow light softened the sharp edges of the apartment around them. Finally, Lasara lowered her gaze toward the untouched med kit resting on the table. In my world, she said quietly, nobody risks themselves without expecting ownership in return. Mason looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Then your world sounds exhausting. Another silence followed, but this one felt different somehow. Softer, less defensive. Lasara slowly reached toward the med kit at last, though her movements remained cautious. Mason pretended not to notice the tiny tremor in her hand as she touched the latch. Then suddenly every light inside the apartment flickered once. The heater stuttered, and somewhere beyond the window, a low mechanical hum began moving slowly down the street below. The low mechanical hum outside the apartment grew louder until it vibrated faintly through the floor beneath Mason Reed's boots. Lasara reacted instantly. Every muscle in her body tightened, and the metal cup slipped from her fingers onto the table with a sharp clink. Turn off the lights, she whispered. Mason moved without asking questions. The apartment dimmed immediately except for the weak orange glow from the heater near the wall. Outside, blue searchlights swept slowly across rain-soaked windows and rusted fire escapes. A patrol crawler rolled through the street below, with heavy tires hissing against flooded pavement. Mason stepped carefully toward the blinds and pulled one edge aside just enough to look down. 3 colonial security officers stood beside the vehicle while a surveillance drone floated overhead, scanning building exteriors one level at a time. Routine patrol, Mason said quietly. Maybe. No, Lasara replied immediately. They are searching. Mason glanced back at her. She had not moved from the couch, but her breathing had become shallow again. Golden eyes locked onto the window with the alert focus of someone who had survived too many close calls recently. The collar around her throat emitted another faint pulse, and she flinched almost invisibly. Mason noticed anyway. Sit back, he said softly. You are making yourself worse. You do not understand how valuable I am to them. then they should probably stop trying to kill you. For a second, Lasara looked like she wanted to answer. Instead, she lowered her gaze. Outside, the searchlights continued sliding across nearby apartments. Rain distorted the beams into shifting blue rivers across the glass. Mason let the blind fall closed and crossed back toward the couch. You can take the bed tonight. Her head lifted immediately. No, Lasara. I will not sleep in your quarters while you remain exposed. Mason stared at her for a moment before laughing softly through his nose. You say that like this place has royal guest chambers. He pointed toward the tiny bedroom visible through the half-open doorway. It is 6 feet from where I am standing. She ignored the joke completely. Your species is reckless. You have mentioned that. Silence settled again while the patrol vehicle slowly moved farther down the street outside. Mason crouched beside the heater and adjusted the failing temperature dial until warmer air finally pushed into the room. The old machine rattled in protest. Come on, he muttered toward it. You can survive one more winter. Lasara watched him quietly. Not suspicious this time. Curious. Human men in her experience either barked orders or demanded attention. Mason Reed argued with broken appliances and made terrible coffee. The contradiction unsettled her more than threats would have. Her eyes drifted toward the military photos again. Young soldiers smiling beside medical transports beneath foreign skies. Mason noticed where she was looking. Most of them are gone now, he said quietly. The colony wars? He nodded once. 5 years ago. And you survived. Mason leaned back against the wall beside the heater. Depends how philosophical you want to get about it. Lasara studied him carefully. The shadows beneath his eyes. The old scar near his jawline. The way he always positioned himself unconsciously between her and the apartment door. Protector instincts. Permanent ones. You still think like a soldier, she said softly. No, Mason replied after a pause. Soldiers follow orders. Rain continued hammering against the windows while distant sirens echoed through the lower sectors of the colony. The patrol vehicle finally disappeared deeper into the district, its searchlights fading into the storm. Only then did Lasara's shoulders lower slightly. Not fully relaxed, but enough. Mason noticed that too. He stood and grabbed an old gray blanket folded over the couch arm before tossing it gently toward her. Get some sleep. She caught the blanket automatically, though confusion flickered across her face again. What about you? Mason walked toward the kitchen counter and picked up the untouched med kit. I still need to clean those injuries. You are persistent. Occupational hazard. For the first time since entering the apartment, Lasara did not refuse immediately. She watched him quietly as he sat beside the table and opened the old medical kit beneath the soft yellow apartment light. Then, very slowly, she moved closer and sat across from him while thunder rolled above Colony 9 like distant artillery across the stars. The apartment felt strangely quiet after the patrol vehicle disappeared into the storm. Only the soft hum of the heater and the occasional rattle of rain against the windows remained. Mason Reed sat across from Lasara at the small kitchen table while the med kit lay open between them under the weak yellow light overhead. Antiseptic wipes. Old trauma patches. A portable scanner held together with tape near the battery compartment. Nothing impressive. Just enough to keep people alive when hospitals were too expensive. Lasara watched every movement carefully as Mason prepared the scanner. You always carry medical supplies at home? She asked. Former combat medic. Mason replied simply. Habit sticks. He activated the scanner, and pale blue light swept gently across the burns near her shoulder. The device emitted a low warning tone almost immediately. Your nervous system is overstressed, Mason muttered. That collar is pushing electrical feedback through your body. Lasara's expression remained calm, but her fingers tightened slightly around the blanket resting across her lap. It is designed that way. Who designed something like this? Mason asked quietly. People afraid of what I know. He looked up at her then. Really looked. Until now, he had assumed she was some political prisoner caught in a corporate power struggle. But fear like this did not come from ordinary secrets. The storm outside flashed briefly silver as lightning illuminated the apartment windows. Lasara lowered her gaze toward the scanner light moving across her skin. You should not have involved yourself tonight, she said softly. The soldiers were not entirely wrong. Mason sat back slightly in his chair. Meaning? Silence stretched for several seconds. Then she finally spoke. 3 months ago, I worked inside the administrative core of the Colonial Security Directorate. Mason frowned faintly. You were military? Intelligence division. That explained the way she watched exits. The way she measured people before trusting them. Mason leaned against the table edge quietly, while Lasara continued staring at the dim scanner light. I discovered records hidden beneath classified transport logs, she said. Human disappearances. Alien disappearances. Entire refugee shipments rerouted into labor camps beyond the outer mining sectors. Mason's jaw tightened slowly. That sounds impossible. It should be. The apartment grew still again except for the rain and distant thunder beyond the city. Lasara's golden eyes reflected faintly in the scanner light as she finally looked at him directly. When I tried to report it internally, my commanding officer erased the evidence and issued my arrest order before sunrise. Mason felt something cold settle heavily in his chest. Not surprise. Recognition. Corruption inside colonial leadership was practically a local tradition. But hearing it spoken out loud still felt different somehow. More real. So they are hunting you because you know too much, he said quietly. Lasara nodded once. And because I survived long enough to become inconvenient. Mason looked down at the bruising beneath the collar around her throat. Then toward the rain-covered window beyond the kitchen. Somewhere out there, security patrols were still searching sector by sector. Looking for her. Looking for him now too probably. You could still walk away from this, Lasara said suddenly. Before they connect you. To me permanently. Mason laughed softly under his breath while sealing a medical patch against the burn near her shoulder. Pretty sure stepping in front of armed soldiers already counts as permanent. You joke too often during danger. Occupational hazard again. She watched his hands carefully as he worked. Steady hands. Gentle hands. No unnecessary contact. No hidden expectation beneath the kindness. The realization unsettled her more with every passing minute. Finally she spoke again, quieter this time. Why have you not asked for anything? Mason glanced up. Anything. Protection claims among my people are not symbolic. Her voice lowered carefully. A male who shields a female publicly is declaring possession. Obligation. Bonding rights. Mason blinked once. Wait. Lasara looked away first, almost uncomfortable now. Most males would already consider me theirs after what you did tonight. For 2 full seconds Mason simply stared at her across the table. Then he leaned back in his chair and rubbed a hand across his tired face. Well, he muttered finally. That explains why the soldiers looked at me like I was insane. A faint sound escaped Lasara before she could stop it. Not fear this time. Not suspicion. A laugh. Small and breathless, but real enough to warm the cold apartment more than the struggling heater ever could. For a few brief minutes, the apartment almost felt peaceful. Rain rolled steadily against the windows while the old heater pushed warm air through the small room in uneven bursts. Lasara sat quietly across from Mason Reed with the gray blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. And for the first time since he found her in the alley, she did not look ready to run. Mason sealed the last medical patch and leaned back in his chair with a tired sigh. There, he said. Not perfect, but you are no longer one bad day away from collapsing. Lasara lowered her eyes toward the bandages along her shoulder. You treat strangers with unusual care. Comes with the medic thing. No. Her gaze lifted slowly to meet his. It is more than training. Mason looked away first this time, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Maybe I just got tired of watching people get abandoned. Silence settled softly between them again. Outside, Colony 9 continued groaning through another endless storm cycle. Distant engines echoed through the towering industrial blocks while neon reflections shimmered across flooded streets nearly 30 floors below. Mason stood and stretched his shoulders carefully. Every muscle in his body ached from exhaustion. You should try sleeping, he said quietly. We will figure out tomorrow when it gets here. Lasara watched him move toward the couch. And you? Couch. That structure is too small for your spine. Mason blinked once before laughing softly. I appreciate the concern. It was an observation, not concern. Sure it was. To his surprise, the corner of her mouth moved slightly again. Another almost smile. Small enough that most people would have missed it completely. Mason did not. He grabbed an old thermal blanket from the shelf near the couch when suddenly the apartment lights flickered hard. Once. Twice. Then everything went dark. The heater died instantly. Rain and distant thunder swallowed the room. Mason froze. That is not normal, he muttered. A sharp electronic chirp suddenly echoed from somewhere outside the apartment door. Lasara stood immediately. Fear returned to her face, so quickly it was almost painful to watch. They found me. Mason crossed the room silently and looked through the tiny security lens beside the door. His stomach tightened at once. 3 armored security officers stood in the hallway beneath harsh emergency lights, while a surveillance drone floated near the stairwell entrance. One officer held a portable scanner against the wall panel beside Mason's apartment, searching for thermal signatures. "Stay quiet," Mason whispered. Lasara's golden eyes locked onto him. "You need to leave me." "Not happening." Another chirp sounded outside, louder this time. The scanner operator turned toward the apartment door. "Possible bioelectric trace detected," a distorted voice announced through the hallway speaker. Mason's mind raced instantly. If they entered the apartment, Lasara would never make it back out. And now that he had officially claimed protection rights, helping her escape counted as obstruction against colonial enforcement. Prison if he was lucky. Worse if he was not. He looked toward the small bedroom window. 30 floors above street level. No fire escape. No options. Then his eyes moved toward the old maintenance access hatch beside the kitchen floor. Forgotten by most tenants years ago. Probably still connected to the lower service tunnels beneath the building. Lasara. She stepped closer immediately. "What?" Mason pointed toward the hatch. "Maintenance shaft. Leads into utility tunnels under the district." Her expression shifted instantly. "You are coming with me. I will slow them down first." "No." The word came out sharper than anything she had said all night. Mason looked at her quietly in the darkness. Emergency lights from outside cast faint red lines across her silver hair and exhausted face. Fear was there again, but not fear for herself this time. "If we both disappear now, they will track us together," he said softly. "I can buy you time." Another heavy knock slammed against the apartment door. "Colonial security," a voice ordered. "Open immediately." Lasara stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the panic building beneath her controlled expression. "Mason." He reached out before thinking and placed one steady hand lightly against her shoulder. "Warm. Careful. Human." "Hey," he said quietly. "You survived this long before me. You can survive a few more minutes." For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. The storm outside roared against the city while security officers waited beyond the door. Then Lasara slowly lifted her hand and gripped the front of his shirt tightly, like she was trying to hold on to something she had only just found. "You do not understand," she whispered shakily. "Nobody has ever stood between me and danger before." The pounding against the apartment door grew louder. Heavy, precise, professional. Mason Reed could almost picture the security officers outside checking weapon safeties while the drone scanned through the walls for hidden movement. Red emergency lights spilled beneath the doorway in thin, sharp lines across the floor. Lasara still gripped the front of his shirt tightly, her breathing uneven beneath the cold pulse of the restraint collar around her throat. "Listen to me," Mason said quietly. "The maintenance tunnels connect to the old transit system under Sector 8. Stay low and keep moving east until daylight." Lasara shook her head immediately. "I will not leave you behind." Another strike hit the apartment door hard enough to rattle the hinges. "Final warning," the distorted voice announced from outside. "Open the door immediately." Mason crouched beside the floor hatch and forced the rusted latch open with a sharp metallic crack. Cold air drifted upward from the dark shaft below, carrying the smell of wet concrete and old electrical wiring. "Go," he said softly. Lasara did not move. Her golden eyes searched his face desperately, like she was trying to memorize it before losing it forever. Mason reached into the med kit beside the table and pulled out a small signal jammer no larger than his palm. Old military surplus. Illegal in 3 systems. This should disrupt the collar tracker for maybe 15 minutes once you are underground. He pressed it into her hand. "After that, you are on your own." "Mason." The apartment door suddenly shook again as electronic tools began cutting through the lock mechanism outside. Sparks flashed beneath the frame. Time was gone. Mason placed one hand gently against her cheek before he could think better of it. Warm skin, rain-cooled silver hair, wide, frightened golden eyes staring back at him beneath the emergency lights. "Hey," he said quietly. "You survived corrupt governments, prison transports, and an entire city hunting you. Do not let my terrible apartment be where your story ends. Something inside Lasara broke then. Not visibly, not dramatically, but Mason saw it in the way her expression softened with sudden, painful understanding. No bargaining, no expectation, no ownership hidden behind the kindness. Just a tired human trying to save someone because leaving her behind felt wrong. The lock outside finally snapped. Mason stepped back immediately and drew a compact pulse tool from beneath the kitchen counter. Not enough to win a fight, just enough to slow one down. Go now. Lasara stared at him one final second before lowering herself into the dark maintenance shaft below the apartment floor. But before disappearing completely, she looked back up at him through the shadows. You asked earlier why they fear me, she whispered. Mason tightened his grip on the pulse tool. Not exactly the best timing for backstory. I am not intelligence division, she said softly. I am heir to the Celestian throne. Mason blinked once. You are what? The Directorate has been using colonial sectors to fund an illegal war against my people. Her eyes glowed faintly gold in the darkness beneath the floor. If they silence me before I return home, billions will never know. Another crash echoed through the apartment door. Mason looked from the shattered lock to Lasara beneath the floor. Then he laughed quietly in disbelief. Of course you are secretly royalty, he muttered. Because apparently my life was not complicated enough. For the first time all night, Lasara smiled fully. Small, sad, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance. Then she reached upward suddenly and caught his hand tightly. You claimed me before armed men, she whispered. In my world, that bond cannot be erased. Mason stared down at her in the darkness while alarms echoed through the hallway outside. Lasara, her fingers tightened around his hand once. Now, she said softly, emotion trembling beneath every word. You are mine as well. Then the apartment door exploded inward in a flood of red emergency light and armored shadows, while Lasara disappeared silently into the darkness below. The storm over Colony 9 lasted until morning. Rain hammered endlessly against steel towers while emergency sirens echoed through the lower sectors for hours after the security raid. Mason Reed barely remembered most of it clearly afterward. Just fragments. Red hallway lights. Armored officers flooding through the apartment. The sharp smell of ozone from overloaded electronics. Then darkness. When consciousness finally returned, the first thing he noticed was silence. Real silence. Not the mechanical noise of the colony. Not traffic. Not generators. Soft silence. Clean silence. Mason opened his eyes slowly against unfamiliar white light above him. Smooth curved walls surrounded the room instead of rusted apartment panels. Pale silver symbols drifted softly across transparent displays near the ceiling. Medical monitors pulsed beside the bed in calm blue rhythms unlike any human system he had ever seen. For one confused second, he thought he might still be unconscious. Then he noticed the stars outside the enormous window beside him. Not city lights. Actual stars. His pulse jumped instantly. Mason tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain shot through his shoulder and ribs. Easy. The voice came softly from nearby. He turned toward it instinctively. Lasara sat beside the medical bed wearing dark silver clothing marked with faint glowing patterns along the sleeves and collar. Her silver hair fell loosely over one shoulder, no longer wet from rain or tangled from exhaustion. The restraint collar was gone. Without it, something about her presence felt different. Stronger somehow, like the room itself subtly reacted to her existence. Yet her golden eyes looked exactly the same when they met his. Relieved. Well, Mason muttered weakly. This is definitely nicer than my apartment. A small smile touched her lips instantly. Your apartment possessed a certain charm. That heater was trying its best. Lasara looked down briefly before speaking again. You were unconscious for nearly 16 hours. Mason frowned faintly. The raid. My people intercepted the security transport before you were transferred off-world. His tired brain took a second to process that sentence fully. Then another. Wait, he said slowly. Your people. As if answering him directly, the doors behind Lasara slid open with a soft metallic whisper. 3 towering alien guards entered wearing polished white armor lined with glowing gold trim. They moved with disciplined precision before lowering themselves onto one knee simultaneously toward Lasara. Your Highness, one of them said respectfully. Mason stared at the scene in silence for several seconds. Then he looked back toward Lasara, lying calmly beside his medical bed. You really were not exaggerating about the throne thing. She almost laughed. Almost. No. The guard stepped aside moments later as another figure entered the room. Older. Regal. Turquoise skin touched faintly with silver near the eyes. The woman carried herself with effortless authority that reminded Mason uncomfortably of military commanders he used to know. Yet when she looked toward him, her expression softened unexpectedly. So, the older woman said carefully, "You are the human who stood before armed soldiers for my daughter." Mason blinked once. Daughter? Of course. Why would his life become normal now? Lasara stood slowly beside the bed. Mother, this is Mason Reed. The older woman studied him quietly for several long seconds before speaking again. You protected her when it offered you no advantage. No wealth. No status. Not even safety. Mason shifted awkwardly against the medical pillows. Honestly, ma'am, at the time I mostly thought I was helping someone having a terrible night. To his surprise, the queen smiled faintly at that. And that, she said softly, is precisely why she trusts you. Silence settled gently through the room afterward while stars drifted slowly beyond the massive viewing window. Somewhere out there, fleets moved between worlds. Governments lied. Wars waited in shadows. But inside the quiet medical chamber, none of it seemed to matter for one fragile moment. Lasara stepped closer to the bedside until warm golden light from the displays reflected softly in her eyes. Then, without fear or hesitation this time, she reached down and took Mason's hand carefully in both of hers. In my world, she whispered, power earns obedience. Her fingers tightened gently around his. But kindness, she looked toward him with something deeper than gratitude shining quietly beneath the starlight. Kindness is sacred. Outside the window, endless stars reflected in her eyes at last. And for the first time since Mason Reed had met her in that rain-soaked alley, they no longer looked cold.